Hello friends! Today I wanted to introduce you to the most sciencey and technical aspect of art therapy, and that is a theory called the Expressive Therapies Continuum. So there we are. So basically the way our brain works is that we shift between these levels. Ideally, when you hit the creativity spot, you're using all of these levels together: cognitive, symbolic, perceptual, affective, that's a fancy word for emotions, kinesthetic, which is movement, and sensory. However, sometimes we get stuck on a certain level, especially when it comes to trauma. And so when we come up with our therapy activities, we think about where you're currently at or processing things on the creative therapies continuum. And then we try and do an activity that will shift you to another space. So different activities are associated with all of these. Affective emotion, we tend to think of watercolors. There's very little control. It moves, it's free, it's flowing a lot like emotions. If we're going more over here to like cognitive and perceptual, you would do something with a lot more control. Say just a pencil like this, or maybe collage materials, because you can cut and control that very well. But these are associated with, these are right brain activities: symbolic, affective, and sensory, whereas these ones are the left brain: cognitive, perceptual, kinesthetic. The interesting thing about these that I read in my textbook was if you're too far from the middle on one side, it becomes very hard to do the other. For example, actually a little bit is good. So perceptual is a lot of like thinking from someone else's perspective, looking at a situation for what it is. You can look at all the facts and try and come to a conclusion, and it might work. If you put in a little bit of emotion in there, if you try and empathize with the other person, think of what their emotions are, think of what your emotional response has been, it can give you a better perceptual understanding of the situation. But if you go too far into the emotions, have you heard someone say that they were just so emotional they couldn't think straight? A lot of times in research, if someone has a bias, like if they're in a relationship with someone, then their emotions can cloud their judgment. And so we try to avoid biases if we count on you to have a perceptual understanding of the situation. And I find that very interesting. So if someone is over here on affective, they might be acting rather manic. I'm not sure exactly how you would treat a manic episode, but if your symptoms were maybe really angry or very depressed, and you're just so caught up in this whirlwind of emotions, watercolor is not probably something we would give you. We'd want to slow down that processing a lot. Pencils, colored pencils, markers, it's much slower to fill a page with a pencil or a marker than it would be with a paintbrush, for example. But if you're someone who's always over here in left brain, thinking very rigidly, very black and white, we would try and get you over here. We might do some symbolic thinking by talking about stories and illustrating stories and seeing if there's any symbols that relate to our life. We probably would try and get someone who's very controlled and clean and tight. You might want to get a paintbrush into their hand and try and let it just flow through them, have less control out of what comes out onto the paper. So all of these levels, this is also, an adult would most likely reach and be able to use all of these. Some of them are more developmental levels. So if we're dealing with, if our clients are infants or toddlers, we can work with kinesthetic and sensory, but a toddler might not be thinking symbolically. So they just haven't reached this upper level yet. And so when we work with young children, we would stick more towards this kinesthetic and sensory level where the outcome doesn't matter. We might not be making anything in particular. This is also good for if you're trying to go back to pre-verbal memories in an adult. And so, as we were saying, if someone is kinesthetic and they are moving, that can help them take in some of their senses. So if we're doing finger paint or clay, the more they touch it, the more they sense it. But if someone is moving around too fast, they're spinning in circles, they're throwing things, they're not sensing it anymore. I've heard that with food a lot. You know, if you eat your food too fast or chewing too fast, you never got a chance to taste it. And so for some people, even if they are more developmentally developed, they might still be at this kinesthetic stage. They can't sit down and talk. They have to be moving. If it's clay, we might be throwing some clay or, rolling to a ball and then pounding it. If it's markers, we might be doing scribbles and, getting a lot of that anxious energy out through scribbles. We can move over to sensory if we have, say, scented markers instead, or if that clay is wet. Some people think it's gross, some people think it's calming. There's a lot of senses that we can engage in. Finger paint. You can bring in some other scents, aromatherapy, essential oils, and whatnot, so on and so forth. Sometimes if someone has panic attacks, we might make a sensory box, which is a box they can carry with them, and they have an object for each of their senses. We might have a type of gum for taste. We might have a certain body spray for smell, a certain type of blanket or sweater for touch that we could talk, maybe some bubble wrap. So that's bringing someone down from an emotional state down to a very sensory state. So that is how our levels work. And we meet someone where they're at. And ideally, we can get a balance of movement and sensing, of perceiving and feeling, and of thinking and planning things, and having a symbolic representation in. Humor tends to come up on this level. If someone's being very sarcastic in their drawing, very funny, even satire, that's way up here in cognitive and symbolic. There's some really interesting pieces to work on. So I'll dive into each of those areas a bit more in future videos. All right, bye.